All right, well, why don't we get started? First off, I think a big thank you to everybody that has made it into the room. I think we're sitting or standing between you and the weekend. And for some of you, that might mean going to the happiest place on earth. Although, a carbon conference ought to be, for many of us, a pretty happy place. But, thank you guys for turning out. We'll, I think, have a really interesting discussion. I'm joined by two subject matter experts who have both complementary but very different backgrounds. So I think we'll be able to cover a pretty broad set of topics. So my name is Jamie Callendar. I'm a managing director with Inlandsis Fund. Inlandsis Fund is a Canadian headquartered carbon investment fund. So we've funded about a little over 30 projects across North America, mostly in the California compliance offset market, but also the Alberta carbon market and the voluntary carbon market as well. So I've been involved in carbon for about 15 years now, and very much looking forward to the discussion with my colleagues. And I'll let maybe Islay first, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then Tim afterwards.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Islay Lord from Parhelion Underwriting. We are a climate risk finance business, and we offer advisory and transactional risk and insurance services to our clients. As a company, Parhelion was formed by Julian Richardson, the founder, in 2006, so has been operating in the carbon market space all that time. And since 2014, I believe, we have offered an invalidation risk product for the compliance market here in California for compliance-grade offsets. I will hold my hand up and say I'm not a carbon expert. I've not been in the field for as many years as so many of my distinguished and peers have here. This is my first conference, which I've found thoroughly enjoyable, informative, and just as an observation, I think I've spent 20 years in the insurance market in specialty and commercial insurances. 10 of those years have been in Pakistan, India, and Dubai latterly. So I'm acutely aware of my carbon footprint. But really, it's only in the last sort of couple of years, I feel, as a sort of layperson, that climate has come to the forefront. And working with Parhelion in the last year, we contributed to the working groups on Mark Carney's task force for the scaling up of the voluntary market. And we're fielding inquiries on a weekly basis from many different players and actors in this sector. And it shows sort of how much of momentum there is, and sort of that head of steam is gathering. In terms of insurance, we'll go on to talk about that in more detail. There are challenges, that's for sure. And I think many of them are coming, I've sort of witnessed coming out in the last few days here. There are challenges, there are frustrations, there are obstacles to overcome. But it's, in certain ways, we're moving in the right direction. So I'm going to stop there because we've got more to carry on with, and hand over to Tim.
Hi, everyone. Tim Kramer. I'm the managing director of SIG Carbon. SIG Carbon is a part of Spatial Informatics Group. Spatial Informatics Group is an environmental think tank consultancy that's kind of focusing on developing innovative solutions to land management problems. SIG Carbon, the team that I lead, is primarily focused on developing IFM credits, forest carbon, in both the voluntary and compliance space, and kind of the nuts and bolts of generating credits. But because of SIG's broader mission, the academic background that we have, and kind of our deep bench in remote sensing, we've been looking at how to apply remote sensing and innovative technologies to help scale up forest carbon, and try to, also then adding and how to do that in a way that's transparent, and do that in a way that brings integrity to the process to kind of eliminate the black box of it. So one of the main things that we're doing on that front is we're working with a group of academics that have a group called the Forest Carbon Framework, which is a NASA CMS carbon monitoring system funded effort, trying to look at how we look to estimate the uncertainty envelopes around biomass estimates and how to then translate that into forest carbon protocols. So, interesting area, and looking forward to talking with all of you about it.
Well, thanks, Tim and Isla. Definitely diverse backgrounds. I think it'll make it really quite interesting to see the questions that the audience has. And definitely, I think the key to any panel that I've witnessed is the engagement of the audience. So I do encourage folks later on to ask questions. I'll try to tee up a few questions initially for each panelist just to get the discussion going, and then I'll let others in the audience ask questions. But I thought, given that we're pretty late in the conference, everyone's probably a little tired and planning their weekends, and maybe some of you are getting texts from your significant other saying the kids are losing it and you better get here soon. I thought maybe I'd tee up Tim first. If you could maybe just, since our goal today is really to talk about the integrity of offsets and increasing the confidence in offsets, which is challenging. If you could kind of hit on your top three or three or four kind of items that you feel have to be in any forest carbon offset project to be really viewed as high quality, and what are those things, so that if someone in the audience is perhaps buying offsets, looking to buy offsets, maybe they're from a Fortune 500 company, reputation is really important. What are those checklist items that they should think of when they look at an offset project, and maybe make their life really easy and they can take notes. And
I'm not sure if I can answer all of that and give great advice, but I can tell you like I was saying before, what we do is we develop forest carbon offsets. Like we go through that entire process. And when I think about integrity of forest carbon offset and the forest offset development process, the first word that always comes to mind for me is transparency. You'll hear me say it over and over again, but to me, that's the foundation of the whole entire process, is being able for people to understand, basically allowing people to be able to look under the hood, to be able to see how an offset is developed. And then the other piece of it is just like, what are the underlying assumptions that go into this? I think oftentimes people forget about that when they think about the development process, is that you start with data. And to turn data into offsets, you need to make a lot of assumptions. And that's fine. It's a part of the process. But making sure those assumptions are very clearly laid out, they're transparent, that if somebody disagrees with them, that there's an opportunity to look at it. And I think that it's just a very fundamental part of the forest carbon offset development process, and I think it is key. And then just thinking about how we apply it on our end it's like how do you turn that into reality? For us, it's like designing projects for transparency, which comes down to designing it for verification. You want to be able to make sure that when you put a project, that you organize information, you put it out there, what are your assumptions? How are you developing that project in such a way that everybody can see all those pieces as clearly as possible? Because somebody's going to disagree with you. Like we get our projects verified and they disagree with us all the time. And that's fine. It's just making that process as easy as possible to ensure that integrity is there. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Thank you.
So, Isla, if somebody skipped over any of Tim's ideas, or perhaps they had all the best intentions in the world, but an issue came up with their offsets. When you look at it from an insurance point of view, particularly, I think maybe starting in the compliance market as being just sort of a more established market, and I know for Inlandsis, our experience a lot of it has been in the California compliance offset market. What exists for insurance products that, if you've got someone that's risk averse, perhaps on the buyer side, that doesn't want the liability around invalidation, how would they go about getting insurance, and what does it look like as a product that they could get?
Certainly, so a good place to start. So the product that we offer in the Californian compliance market is, it could either be buyers, it could be project developers. and it gives certainty to that invalidation risk. So within the compliance market, many of you will be aware, there are invalidation provisions that the California Air Resources Board put in from the very beginnings, I understand it, that if a project is found to have breached one of these invalidation provisions, those being overissuance, double counting, and a breach of environmental regulations, the offsets are they're invalidated, so they're worthless. And alongside that sits buyer's liability. So if you, as the buyer of those credits or offsets, you are sitting on a financial loss because you've lost the value of those credits. And that's where the insurance comes in. So the insurance would actually make you whole, make up for that loss, and indemnify you for the lost value of those offsets. And added to that, the coverage that we offer, the replacement cost will actually give you the value to buy an allowance rather than just the offset value. So that in terms of protecting the integrity of your investment, that's what the insurance is there to do. Now, it works very well within the framework of the Californian compliance market because you've got very clear triggers to the insurance with those invalidation provisions, and you've got that buyer's liability. So, it works for the insurance point of view, and it works within the structures of the compliance market.
And have you seen, in terms of uptake of that product, are you seeing, is it sort of, if I'm going to characterize industries, is it kind of a risk-averse utility type company that says, I do not want to take that risk, I cannot have this go up to my board of directors? Are you seeing project developers actually pursue this and try to offer it to get a premium for price, or who's sort of the landscape?
Well, I mean, interestingly, I think when the product was first introduced, as I understand it, the thoughts were that it would be project developers, wrapping their offsets and being able to offer those at a higher price. We have seen greater uptake from, as you say, sort of regulated entities, those that are sort of more risk averse.
And with the compliance market, the framework's pretty well established and the system's been in place, but the voluntary market is really the other end of the spectrum. And where do things sit with the insurance industry and offering solutions? Are they kind of all customized, or are there some actually more off-the-shelf type solutions available for people, or is it just entirely evolving? Every day is different, or?
In terms of, so we're sort of juggling two things here at Parhelion. The intense interest from the voluntary market, but the lack of that regulatory framework. The two things that make this particular insurance work in the compliance market, the clear invalidation provisions and the buyer's liability, they don't exist in the voluntary market. So it's more of a challenge then, and I think somebody brought up a question earlier in one of the sessions this week, was, how do we, what are the mechanisms in the voluntary market for calling out bad credits or low quality credits? And that is, and we are seeing, and it's very encouraging to see the work of the Integrity Council and VCMI in that direction, and because the increased transparency and clarity and the increased regulation that's coming into the market will also give the insurance companies that reassurance that they are dealing with a professional marketplace. And we're not there yet. I've been very encouraged, and then sort of attending a couple of the sessions this morning on Article 6. It's like, wow, we've still got a lot of flesh to put on the bones, because I'm also thinking this is something that insurers have to get their head around. Often the discussions that we're having as Parhelion with insurance companies, those that are going to underwrite the risk, is it's carbon 101. We have to start from the very beginning, never mind going into the nuances and the complexities of projects and the market and how it operates. So we're heading in the right direction, but we don't have off-the-shelf box products as such. We work with our clients individually, and we tease out the risks that they themselves are facing, and clients have very different opinions and very different risk appetites. So that's certainly how we would approach it, and then we're making that sort of match between what the insurers are willing to insure. So they won't, for example, take on that speculative risk. That's not the part or the part that insurance plays in this.
So I guess if we have a blue carbon project, there's just not a nice bucket to put that into yet.
Not
but maybe,
yet.
Maybe the next NACW or the one after. And so maybe going back to Tim, for the sort of the engineers and the scientists out there, I think there's usually that predisposition to say technology is the answer, and it doesn't really matter what the question was. It's technology is the answer, and we're seeing a lot of different innovative technologies, whether it's machine learning and artificial intelligence, and they're finding their way into the carbon market and trying to make things more scalable or more cost-effective, or perhaps you've got remote regions and some of these technologies can make it just more feasible to do a project. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on where those technologies are fitting in currently and where things are actually improving the integrity of offsets, and perhaps where there's some challenges with that, where the private sector at times, I think, does want to keep certain things proprietary as an competitive advantage, but the offset development process by nature involves, publicly posted methodologies that anybody could access, and so there can be a bit of a mismatch there. So I'd be curious on your thoughts on remote sensing and other types of applications in forest carbon.
Sure. Yeah, it's a big area, and there's a lot happening. And I think trying to figure out how it's all going to fit together is part of the challenge. And I guess kind of starting where in the beginning there, it's, I guess like when SIG or SIG Carbon looks at technology and we think about how we're going to use it in the forest carbon development process, I guess there's two ways of looking at it. You can kind of get the top down. It's like, we have this cool thing, what can we use it to do? Or you can take it from the bottom up, which is, we have a whole shelf full of cool things. Which one fits best in this particular scenario? And the approach that we at SIG Carbon are trying to take is more the bottom up approach. Building things for the purpose, and that's a really big piece of it. And the best way to kind of explain it and how I think about it is that developing a forest carbon project is very linear. There's a place, there's a starting point. You have a landowner who's interested in looking at how much carbon do they have, how much revenue are they going to generate, all the way through the development process, all the way through to the end when you get MRV, where you have an existing project and you need to monitor it for a long period of time. I think technology has a place within the entire pipeline of the project, but which technology applies to which part of that, I think, varies. And I think it's kind of easy to miss it. You just think, I'm going to have this shiny thing that I want to put at forest carbon, and it doesn't seem to work that way. Just from, and kind of to your latter point there, which is that the protocols by nature have very specific requirements, and they're designed in a certain way. They're not designed for the technology. They're designed to meet requirements of transparency and quality that are needed by the marketplace. And so I think instead of trying to think about technology and how to change the protocols to meet the technology, I think that there's more work that is needed to design to kind of integrate the technology into the needs that the protocols and the registries are trying to achieve. And just from that nature, that pipeline that I just laid out, the need for the technology is easier to apply on each end. You have a landowner. I think the AI, remote sensing, model-based carbon estimates, all of that is easier to apply in the beginning, helping landowners understand how much carbon do they have, how much revenue can they generate from it. As an example, like somebody comes to us, we can usually turn around numbers and estimates within a couple weeks, maybe a month, depending on how busy we are. And I think it should take a minute. Like you as a landowner should be able to come, click a button, and it should be able to tell you generally how much carbon and how much revenue you can generate and what your options are. I think the technology is there to do that. It's just that there isn't a spot for it. There isn't it hasn't been designed and built up yet. Same on the tail end, you get MRV. It's you're monitoring projects from afar. They exist, we know where they are, you have boundaries. The remote sensing technology can look at that property and can monitor it. You can add change detection algorithms that can tell you how many trees were cut down and where and volumes. So all of that is there, and it can be developed. In some places it is being developed, and I think in other ways it's about to happen. But those are the easy answers. And then as you kind of take the technology and you move to the hard part, which is integrating it into protocols and the technology.
And the NASA work you're doing, and how does that overlay into this? I know it's directly related, but can you expand a bit on it? It'd be interesting.
So the NASA work is, it's kind of, it's looking at, so when you get a remote sensing biomass model-based estimates, and basically it gives you a pixel for different spots on the landscape. The problem it'll give you a number. This is how much biomass is there. The problem is you don't know how accurate that number is. There's absolutely no way. And some are very accurate in some places on the landscape, and at other points it's very inaccurate, but you have no way of teasing that out. The NASA work that we're doing is basically looking at the envelopes of uncertainty, predicting how much uncertainty is in that estimate per pixel, so that you can pick any arbitrary project area, put a box around it, and it'll give you a level of uncertainty for that particular project area. And then how that, and the smaller it is, usually the more uncertainty, the larger, the less, the more certain you are. But the thinking behind it is that the uncertainty is almost more important than the biomass estimates. And the reason is because the protocols, that's basically how they're designed. They're designed to reduce uncertainty. And so if you can design the technology and you can actually focus the technology on the piece that's most important for the registries and the verification process, which is how accurate are those estimates, then you can start to figure out what type of data is needed to reduce your uncertainty. Is more inventory data needed? Is LiDAR needed? Is it more JEDI data? Whatever it is, you can start to tease it out and figure out how to reduce uncertainty.
I can see the marketers' wheels turning already, thinking, "Oh, NASA was involved in this. I can put that in my little description." But Isla, I guess one area that I think technology has struggled with, honestly, in trying to solve the problem is really with wildfires, and we're just seeing devastating wildfires in lots of regions, and quite recently in kind of around Boulder, Colorado. There were wildfires in December, right around Christmas, and then 3 months later in March, when it's supposed to be winter and it's supposed to be wetter, and we're just seeing it as a huge challenge, just overall for society. But for carbon projects, it's a very obvious challenge. But how is that functioning from an insurance standpoint in terms of if Tim comes to you with a carbon project and says, unfortunately, this one's in the western U.S., it's not immune to these risks. We think it's a good project, but ultimately there's some wildfire risk here. What are the solutions that could be brought into that type of a project?
Well, they're very pertinent, and in terms of the timing, in the last sort of couple of months, there has been solutions that have come through on the insurance side for wildfire risk, and it works on a parametric basis. Which means that you agree that indemnity up front at the beginning of the insurance coverage period. So there's no loss assessment as such. So for a wildfire in particular, you're looking at the number of acres and the value, obviously, of that land, but specifically looking at what the projected carbon credit revenue will be from that project, and that would be your insurance policy. So you pay your premium, and should there be any fire, that is assessed in terms of the extent of the damage, and I do believe they are using remote sensing for that. And you would get a payout of the agreed amount, that being the sort of parametric angle of the insurance coverage. So it's a new product, it's new coverage, but I'm excited to sort of see that come into play.
So I'm very, very curious on sort of the value of carbon if it's say a 30-year or even more perhaps lifespan of the carbon project, and if it was a voluntary project, things that is that a really big struggle to try to work with that project developer and come to some sort of terms around what that carbon might be worth under such a long-term horizon?
I think it's touching on a couple of things there. For the solution that I was just talking about, that would be an annual renewable policy. So we're not necessarily sort of going down the route of the long-term duration, which is not something that the insurance world is comfortable with. The majority of policies are issued and renewed on an annual basis, and then you'll get a sort of 3-year or 5-year term at most, generally speaking. So, and I know we're going to probably move on to permanence, but that long-term nature of the projects it's a challenge to the insurance markets, because you will never get a 30-year insurance policy or a 100-year insurance policy.
Right. And in terms of perhaps for a lot of corporations, maybe the risk that they worry about and lose sleep about the most often is really the reputational risk. And we've seen there is quite a lot of opposition to offsets in lots of different places, and usually if someone's writing an article about it, they will want to find kind of the biggest brand name they can, and try to connect the dots between specific projects even, and different owners in the value chain, and it can be quite challenging, and I think that creates fear for some of the corporations around reputation. And are there things coming down the pipe to try to help on that? I know it's a fuzzy sort of topic, but I guess how do you think about that when a corporate asks you for an evaluation of the potential ways you could help them around that risk? I mean, how would you respond to that type of scenario?
And it's certainly it's a real concern, and we hear it a lot. That's a reputational risk, and it's something that, from an insurance perspective, we really have to unpick. Is it a delivery or performance risk? Has the protocol been followed? Is it a concern that maybe sort of those additional attributes that corporate buyers bought into, they failed to deliver? So it's you wouldn't be able to go to the insurance market and say, I'd like to sort of buy your reputational risk cover. You have to sort of unpick it, unravel, and look at a different way in, as it were. One of the things that we're looking at currently is that third-party fraud or negligence cover. So looking at that on behalf of funds or investors or buyers, because that would be one of the contributing factors that could cause a reputational exposure. Has there been fraud or negligence within the life of the project? And so, we're sort of working on that insurance coverage. In fact, quite close to closing something there and sort of pinning that down. There's a risk with involuntary reversals, in so much as, yes, you'll get replacement credits from a buffer, but as that corporate, you're not guaranteed to get those replacement credits from the specific project type that you have decided fits within your corporate policy or strategy. So given that you're not getting that like-for-like replacement, there's an insurance angle there. So that's more about a policy approach. Political risk is another one. In terms of those project developers that are operating in countries where there is definitely a risk of expropriation. We've heard again under Article 6 that the voluntary market, it almost seems inevitable in some ways, will be pulled into the compliance market, and there sadly are still countries out there in which many of these projects are operating, which are exposed to that expropriation risk. So political risk, it's a known and understood insurance coverage within the market. So that's something likely that we will be looking at.
Oh, it's I think a really interesting evolution, especially that sort of voluntary merging into compliance over the long run, and suddenly what was maybe many years ago a lower value credit suddenly becomes very valuable potentially, and any of those risks that weren't mitigated could well be contentious items.
Absolutely, and I think from an insurer's angle, the more regulated and the more structured the voluntary markets are, the more relatable and appealing a risk it is to underwrite. Right. Especially until the insurance market on a wider level has a greater understanding of the intricacies and the complexities of the carbon market.
And going back to Tim, I think on one of your earlier comments you touched on transparency as being kind of the paramount sort of principle of high integrity offsets, but one area that we're seeing a lot of activity in, and I know this isn't perhaps your focus area, but I think a lot of these elements are very relevant to forest carbon, but in the agriculture space, there is just a ton of activity, and different companies are approaching it quite differently, and in some cases, I think there's a huge data angle, both for complementary businesses, but also just on the pure carbon aspect. And we're seeing certainly some companies taking almost a proprietary approach, other companies taking sort of the more traditional route with the offset protocols that are available, like the Climate Action Reserve Protocol. But I guess, Tim, in your experience in forest carbon, which is quite a bit more mature of a market than in the agricultural soils carbon market, where do you see some of the challenges to moving forward as the market gets to be a bit more mature? And a few more protocols will probably be approved in the coming years. But where do you see that sort of heading? If you use forestry as kind of the one that's done it before, where do you think that might go, just from a high-level point of view?
I'm not an expert in the soil carbon or agricultural carbon space, but I do see that it's a much, just from a landscape scale. There's a lot more land. I think that there are. In some ways, it's a little simpler because you don't have to measure trees and tree heights and species composition. You can more manage. You can look at like land use change, and I think that space, implying remote sensing to it makes a lot of sense. Everything that I've seen coming out of it's more. It kind of falls on the transparency scale. Like if you're changing agricultural practice, if you say you're not going to change an agricultural practice, you're doing no-till or whatnot, you should be able to monitor that from space and look at that. The piece of it that what I'm kind of surprised at that I don't see more of, and maybe it's just I'm not looking in the wrong spot, but it's more of just in the public space. There's a proprietary aspect of it, but at the same time, I think that to really put integrity to projects, I think all of us should be able to open up a computer, go to a website, be like, where are those projects at? What are they saying they're going to do? And we should be able to look at them and review and say, is that really happening? Like, I think that, we can do it with Google Maps, you can do it with Google Earth. Why can't we just pick up, identify every single one of those projects on a registry and zoom in on it and verify that they're not actually doing it with your own eyes? And so
I feel like there could be an army of university students out there policing this world. But I think that's maybe a good segue to audience questions, and would definitely love to hear from all of you. And ask the tough questions. We've got smart people sitting next to me, and yeah, go for it. And please speak as loud as you can.
I think you did go act to help develop soil enrichment protocol. So I can tell you why that data might be hard to be as public as others, because they're people and there's privacy issues. So we have growers within our project that don't want their names or practices made public. So we'd like to make it as transparent as possible, but have to protect some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Because we choose to. Second, I'd like to acknowledge that you mentioned uncertainty is one of the most important parts of quantification, and I would say yes, it is. And one of the missing holes in most methodologies is measurement uncertainty. So most methodologies imply that every tool is created equal. The soil enrichment protocol has three sources of uncertainty: sampling uncertainty, how many measurements you take; measurement uncertainty, what tool did you use, how precise is your scale. And when you incorporate that, then you can incorporate new technologies. Because you can honestly say this technology is more precise than this other one. Forest methodologies, any way you measure a tree height is considered equal. So it's totally looked over. Also, we include modeling uncertainty, which in most methodologies is never considered. So forest protocols, if you use FBS, the Forest Vegetation Simulator, the answer that you get from it is considered true. So I think it's paramount. I think the correct uncertainty should be included, but all sources of uncertainty, and then we can be more honest and open about evolving technologies and what we're actually quantifying.
And I completely agree with you, and that makes perfect sense. A similar analogy that I have on our end is that some problem that we have with our modeling is that when forest carbon, what's the underlying data? When you look at these model-based estimates that are spitting out basically a biomass estimate or an estimated tree list for every pixel, how did they generate that? That is coming from it's called a imputational model, where you're taking existing forest carbon plot inventory data that's scattered across the landscape, and the model looks at it and says, okay, that's the value in that point of space, and what are all the attributes of all these other points in space around it, and then it takes a guess, for an informed guess of what all those other values should be. Well, the more data you put into that system, the more accurate your estimates are. But the problem is that where most of that data, it's all proprietary. It's by landowners. They don't want to share that. Even our work we work directly with FIA, and we have tremendous challenges because FIA does not want to share the exact locations of their plot data. And the same thing applies for every single timber company, private landowner, existing carbon projects. Everyone is very sensitive about the data. So that is it's so super important. And then the other pieces that you're talking about, everyone treats FES as that it's that is truth, but it's not. There's a whole layer of assumptions that are baked in behind that. And I think that's the whole point, is that we all just need to be transparent about all of those assumptions that we're making. You can't really get away from them, but you should focus on each one of them and see if technology can improve each one of those, the uncertainty associated with each one of them, and then try to work on it. Maybe one of them doesn't really have that much of an impact, but there's other ones that make a huge impact, and trying to disentangle those uncertainties and making that clear is very important.
And I guess ultimately having two auditors look at the same project and actually come out with the same answer, and plus or minus the right percentage, but it's challenging. Yeah,
and the other thing I'll add to that is just talking about model-based estimates is that that not all geographies are the same. When you look at the landscape of data that you have that you're plugging into these models, oftentimes there's a lot of data in one spot and almost no data in another geographical region. So you can run that model, and in one area you can stand up and be like, oh, it has this level of accuracy, it's amazing, we're going to use it over here, but that model had no data from that space, and so you're going to get terrible estimates over there. And then the other piece of it is what scale are you looking at? There's just a statistical piece that kind of is baked into it. Where, like I was saying before, if you look at this, if you talk to a scientist and ask how much carbon is in the state of Washington, they'll give you a decent estimate and it'll be pretty good. But if you're asking how much is in that like 500 acres right over here, there's just a small sample size population. And so your estimates are just going to be much more inaccurate. So there's a whole variety of concerns and thinking and how you have to think about it that often just get glossed over, and the model spit it out, so therefore it's right. Like that's, I think we have to be careful.
You have to question the model at times.
Yeah,
too.
you have to question it. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good, stimulating discussion. Are there other questions? Or are we all in our food coma state at the moment? There's got to be. Oh, there we go.
So you folks didn't discuss, this is voluntary carbon, you didn't discuss like truth and confidence for who? The public? What perception? So technology assurance is really important to the industry internally to us, but how about externally?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll add a couple comments and certainly allow the other panelists to comment as well. But I think actually that's probably the toughest audience. Really, is the external. And as you saw with Tim's responses and points earlier, there's a lot of detail here, and it's hard to understand a lot of those details if you're not fluent in them. And I think it's difficult to communicate that level of technical information a lot of times. And frankly, there are some opponents that actually don't necessarily want to dig into that and don't have a real desire, and have perhaps pre-existing views on offsets. And so, in my shoes as an investor, when we look at a project, we do try to evaluate that project versus other similar projects and try to assess, is this a better story, particularly if it's a voluntary project. An example of one we worked on, we funded the purchase of the land from a timber company in order to allow a not-for-profit to put a conservation easement on that land, and then it will be forever wild thereafter with no logging of any sort. And so we felt that type of project told a good story that people could believe in the additionality argument and not just view it as, maybe land that had been owned by them for decades and suddenly is a carbon project and that type of scenario. So there's a lot of that, I think, buyer beware or do your own due diligence, I think, needed, and then find a way to communicate that in a kind of colloquial way that people can relate to, because frankly there are different shades of gray in this industry, and it's quite challenging, and sometimes the worst offenders will taint the rest of the industry in some regards. So I think the folks who are doing really good work in good projects need to really articulate why their projects are good projects and do it quite broadly. But maybe I should ask my other panelists if they'd like to weigh in on that. Or pass.
I guess to talk a little bit about it. I think that, this just gets back to the transparency piece. Like if you want to have, the market's going to change. There's going to be an ever-increasing focus on quality. I put that in quotes all the time because that means different things to different people. But in the end, if you're going to assess what is a good project, you should just be very clear about that. And then when you're talking about, is there assurances on the data and the data analytics, does this project actually represent what we say that it does? I think that it's just being very clear. We should there should be a big focus on making sure that those assumptions are documented, well laid out, and some people are going to only care at the 30,000 foot level, and then you're going to have some people that are going to really get down in the weeds and argue about something, how you applied some rule within the data, and is that data applied to that rule? So I think it's just the system needs to be designed and focused on that, and technology needs to account for that transparency. That's my 10 cents.
Again, from an insurance perspective, we at Parhelion, we've maybe got a foot in both camps in terms of being inside, the idea of the insurance being able to give that the reassurance to investors that any investment will normally carry that insurance to back it up, and certainly what we're seeing from client inquiries is that these purchases are no longer within a marketing budget or a corporate sustainability budget. The amounts that are being invested are sort of much greater than they ever have been before. So it's a board item level. You've got your CFOs questioning, sort of what's the investment and what protection, what insurance have we got around that investment. So we're sort of working within the industry there, the sector there, but on the other side, you have an insurer also questioning what is the validity and what is the quality of these credits. And I think that's very much where one of my points earlier was that we need that guidance from the Integrity Council in terms of the clear core carbon principles. We need to simplify, at least, as you say, at the sort of 30,000 feet level, what the aims are, what the objectives are, because if we are operating sort of within the weeds, then there's no clarity for anybody. So it really is. I'm not saying that level of detail doesn't need to exist, but in terms of certainly for the market to scale and for investment to come in, there does need to be a lot more clarity and simplicity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Are there other questions? There's got to be at least one more curious person out here. All right, we've got one in the back.
Could you speak to increasing best practices around assessing leakage for projects, particularly market-based leakage, where land use is changing from that agriculture to forestry, for example? It feels like a really hard assessment to make huge uncertainty around it. Is there any way to tighten that uncertainty?
That's a really good question. I might look over to Tim on that. I think that as a first point, and then maybe we can add comments around it. But it's I think that's a really key issue.
Yeah, it is, and I think there are several companies out there that are focusing on that and how they evaluate credits that are coming off. Is the leakage value, like what is when you go into a carbon project and you're actually developing it? There's rules. We look at it, we apply those. As I always say, we will always follow the rules that are laid out by the protocol because that's what you have to do to get the credits issued. But then you're kind of getting into a broader conversation about are those leakage rules correct? And I would say the same thing kind of falls for fire and fire risk. Whereas when we develop a forest carbon project, there's a spreadsheet. You go through it and you figure out what your characteristics are. You get a percentage and you lock it in and use it. I think there's a need for technology to start to assess that more broadly. I would say leakage and fire risk are probably tied in together as something where there's a lot of room for improvement. You look at your project, you look at your surrounding area, and you have to figure out, is there actually any, for forest carbon, is there actually timber harvesting occurring in the area? Is that a real thing? Is there a market? Not just assuming that it's there. Same for fire. Like you have a fire risk you assign to it. Can you run a fire model on it to see just how dangerous or what is the ultimate risk of fire for a project? And remote sensing is capable of doing that in the machine learning algorithms. And I think there's companies out there that are really focused on that. It's just going to take a little bit more.
It does seem like it's sometimes a program authority type of issue to work through at the protocol development stage. And I know in our experience, we've certainly seen in Canada, for instance, certain protocols where if it's a government driven process, that they've felt they need to take kind of the most conservative angle, and they're doing it, I think, out of trying to get that abundance of caution and make sure that the number of credits that's being created is as conservative really as it can be. But we have seen that where in some cases the developers have actually gone and used a voluntary offset protocol instead because the potential compliance protocol wasn't actually going to be viable for their project. And the difference between compliance and voluntary was quite large in terms of number of credits. And so it's not that the developers were necessarily trying to pick and choose what worked, for the most optimal outcome for them. It was more that they actually couldn't do the project under the kind of government-driven protocol. So it can be quite challenging, and I've seen wildly different approaches from one part of Canada to another part of Canada in terms of how they go about it. And I think it's just going to continue to have to evolve to get to that, conservative answer in a way that really works for creating the stimulus for the projects to happen.
And I'll add a little bit to that. The other problem, I think this is a very understandable problem, which is that the registries are hesitant to change protocols. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so when you get and then the other thing that's happening is you have a lot of these technologies, like I'll use fire modeling because we work with this at SIG, is, fire modeling is just evolving rapidly. And so if we went to the registry and said, we're going to incorporate these new fire models so we can better identify the risk of fire for any one forest carbon project. By the time we got through the change process for changing the protocol and reviewed it, the fire models would have already evolved and gone further beyond that point, and we'd have to basically go back to start over. Or maybe not start over, but there's just going to be a natural lag time, and there's all that investment. And so I think, that's just an inherent challenge in the process of technology is just going to keep spinning, and it's going to keep evolving and growing, and protocols are going to have a resistance to do that. And so that's kind of my original point, is trying to be able to kind of understand ultimately at the core, what do registries and protocols need? What are they designed to do? And then how do you take the technology to be able to fit into that versus taking a shiny thing and saying everybody needs to follow it? I think that's a key point.
Yeah, I think in the world of scarce resources too, it's hard for whether it's a government or a registry to try to adapt and put the resources in to get the right answer sometimes, and there are imperfections as a result.
Yeah, and also limited understanding of just technical, so these fire models or algorithms, these AI programs are very difficult to understand. I've sat on these calls and it's like another language. There's probably 50 people in the U.S. that understand it all, maybe more now. But it's difficult to expect the registries to be able to understand that in a transparent way. And so it's one of the things that I've thought a lot about is, making sure that you have open source technologies. It's okay for it to be there, but what are the entities and organizations that are there to review it that are independent? If SIG develops a certain model and says everybody needs to, it's awesome, everyone should follow it, no one's going to believe us because we're biased. We're developing forest carbon projects. Maybe there needs to be a solution to create that independent peer-reviewed of technology to kind of how to incorporate it. So,
are there any final thoughts or questions? I think we could probably handle another one or two, but if we don't have any, I can certainly ask panelists to give their final thoughts. Yes, please go ahead.
One more mention that we thought through just exactly that problem that you went over. There's a time lag for the registry to approve a model. Not
Yeah, it's a very big thing, a very real challenge.
Well, maybe I will just ask each of you just to do your final kind of takeaway from the conference. What has stuck out in your mind as sort of maybe the most interesting point you've taken away from the 3 days? And I think I'll start with you, Isla. Any sort of final concluding thoughts on what you've seen, observed, and where are things headed?
Sure, thank you. I don't know, gosh, lots buzzing around. I think for me, it's that push towards transparency, and seeing the number, and it was commented to me as well, just how this conference has grown in terms of the variety of attendees. You're seeing a lot of different actors and players coming into the market, and you're seeing the likes of carbon exchanges, of rating agencies, of investment funds. That all this is a sign of a market that's maturing, and there's a lot going on in terms of the work towards that transparency and making this a transparent and liquid market. And if it's going to scale, that's definitely the way it's going to be. Insurance definitely plays a part in this, in any mature economy and marketplace. And we would certainly work with all players in the market just to determine what those risks are and whether they are insurable, and whether that can help to give confidence to those investments. It's been a real pleasure to be here the last few days. It is my first conference. Hope to be back next year. And I think we'll be sitting a year ahead in terms of all the guidance that's coming out in the next few months, and just to think where we'll be this time next year is exciting. It's mind-boggling in terms of what needs to be achieved. But I certainly, from an insurance perspective, would like to be offering more concrete solutions. And we are demand-led in terms of our clients come to us, and we work with those clients to take things forward from the insurance side of things. But this is a market that is going to grow hugely, and I'm excited to be part of it.
That's a good summary.
Probably won't have as good of a summary there, but so I guess my takeaway just from the conference so far is just that there's a lot of really exciting things that are happening in terms of technology and innovation and how they're being applied to, particularly to the forest carbon space. And I mean, from a perspective of a developer developing forest carbon projects, I've always thought of it, there's by nature a lot of friction in the process. There's a lot of, and what I see happening with all of these technologies is coming in and helping reduce friction at every step of the way to help it scale. If you really want to increase the number of forest carbon projects to the scale that we need to think about all those friction points along the way and try to reduce them to the extent possible. And I think what I see is a lot of efforts, it's technology, innovation, to try to go in and focus on those. And the other piece that I think is actually more difficult that we've been talking about is trying to take that technology and fit it into, I would call it the social component, which is the integrity, the quality factors that we're talking about. So as that becomes more mature and it evolves, I think the technology will grow into that space to help reduce the friction to kind of meet that, and it's exciting to see.
I think you both summarized it very well. I would add the financial sector as an area of needing to reduce friction and continue to be flexible in finding solutions and gradually just make this market become more and more mature and scalable. So I think we all have our part to play, and thank you all for sitting through a session on a Friday right before the weekend, right after lunch. Hope that you've all had a great time at the conference, and I'm sure the three of us will be around probably a little bit if you have individual questions as well.